Okay, so there's a joke in MTG that's like, what scares an MTG player the most? 2 untapped islands. But islands don't deal damage. And why aren't forests as scary as islands? And why untapped? It's because 2 untapped islands can cast counterspell. It wasn't about the islands, it was about what they could do. Sometimes when people are watching a game, they'll talk about one player representing lethal. That player hasn't done lethal damage, they're representing it. Sometimes players will keep a land in their hand later in the game to bluff having a spell or some kind of interaction. If they can convince the other player that the land in their hand is a powerful spell, they can change how that player interacts. They're manipulating the other player based on what the card could be, what it could represent. MTG isn't a game of just reading the board state. It's about anticipating opponents based on incomplete information. They attack with mana up? What does that mean? They tap out and refuse to block? Okay, what does that mean? We're looking at what possible futures the cards could lead to. Newer players tend to think of the game in this kind of additive linear way. You do one thing, then you do another thing, and things just keep happening one after the next, until there's a winner. As you get better, you stop seeing only the now of the game, and you start seeing the entire duration of the game as this long moment. Everything that happens branches the possible future of the game out again and again. 2 mana on the board isn't just 2 mana, it represents a possible creature spell. It also represents a possible ramp spell. But if we change the colors of the mana, we also change what it represents. Now it represents a different creature. It represents a removal spell. To know what something is representing, we need to know what resources our opponents have, what cards they're likely to have, and if we're lucky, we'll also know what their goal is. Reading resources is pretty simple. If they have cards in their hand, they might be able to cast them. If they have mana open on board, they might be able to use it. Knowing what cards are likely is where experience and study come in. Most formats have limits on what cards are illegal to play. By knowing those limits, we can limit the cards we actually have to think about and predict. I don't have to consider Force of Negation in Standard because it's not legal there. If we're familiar with an opponent's deck, we know way more about the cards they might have. If I know my opponent is playing Eldrazi Tron, I know I don't really have to worry about Ragavan when I'm playing against them. In formats like Modern, we might not know our opponent at all, but seeing a few turns of their deck, we'll be able to guess what they're doing. If I see a couple of Tron lands on their side of the board, I can safely say they're playing one of the Tron decks. Now I know what cards are more likely to show up. And this gives us the last bit of information we want. We want to know what their goal is. Of course their goal is to win, but how? Are they trying to fill their graveyard for a living end? Are they trying to build mana for an Epiphany combo? Are they just trying to rush us down? When we know what their goal is, we know more than what cards they have. We know a little bit about how they might prioritize those cards too. That 2-drop that they just played, is that the top of their curve? Or are they baiting us with it to try to get us to expend our resources before hitting us with a 4-drop haymaker? Okay, so that's the basics of representing. Here's where the big change happens. Remember when we talked about how some formats are more mechanically driven than others? This doesn't just change the metagame, it also changes representation. In constructed formats, synergies can be so powerful that we can get a lot of representation information from very little evidence. Seeing a single producer of blue mana means counter magic is live. Not just soon, but now. Seeing a single Tron land doesn't represent one colorless, or the spell it can cast for one colorless. It represents a Tron deck, which means a second Tron land is really likely to follow. And if they're Eldrazi Tron, it means Warping Whale. And then a third Tron land, meaning they can make 7 mana and start dropping tanks on us. You get all that information by seeing one land. What can we do with that info? If the Warping Whale is online next turn, then I need to play whatever sorcery I want to play now, or I'll have to wait until they're tapped out, which might be too late. If I have a creature with 1 power or toughness, I won't be able to keep it for very long, because Whale can eat it. But I could bait out the Whale with a creature I don't need as much, saving a better one for after the Whale is used up. We have all this information, but the thing is, it's all prediction. None of this has happened in the game yet. They might not have the Warping Whale. They might not be Eldrazi Tron, they might be Green Tron. They might not have the second Tron land at all. We might not have any way to play around any of this, no matter what. All of these things are possible, and we have to navigate those possibilities without overcommitting to them. As we move along the continuum towards sealed, representation changes. They're attacking with a 2/2 into my 3/3 with 2 mana up. They probably have a combat trick, right? Or are they just bluffing a combat trick to try to cram some free damage? What trick could they cast? What combat tricks and removal are in this set? Do they have the right mana for them? The work of reading what cards represent is much more focused on combat here. It's more about trying not to get blown out when your opponent gets you with a good combat trick, or 2-for-1s you if you try to enchant something. In fundamental-driven games, creatures and mana mostly represent attacks, defenses, and removal. They might represent a 2-for-1 or a swing for 5 damage, which can be game-changing. In mechanics and synergy-driven metagames, creatures represent their abilities. Usually the first steps of powerful combos that could wipe a board, draw a massive pile of cards, or deal over 10 damage, sometimes over 20. The more synergy-driven a deck is, the higher the ceiling is on what mana represents. For an aggro deck, 5 mana might mean 3 attackers, or an attacker and 2 burn spells. For a combo deck, it can mean infinite creatures and damage. Learning to read representation is basically about reading who's the beatdown in Limited, who has advantage in Constructed, or threat assessment in EDH. If you're reading what the board state represents, then at any given moment in a Limited game, you can see which player has attacks. You have attacks if you can attack in a way that's good for you. Either you don't lose your attacker, or you could use one attacker to eat a lot of their blockers. Whoever has attacks should be pressing their advantage to try to end the game before the other player can take advantage. In Constructed, the game doesn't revolve around attacking as much. It's more about synergies, so advantage isn't about reading the attacks so much as reading all the other things a card could represent. Ragavan and Murktide on board without blockers is really strong, but if Living End is about to go off, it's hard to say that the Izzet deck here has advantage. In EDH, things shift again. In 1v1, you want to get advantage and keep it, and once you have it, you want to press it. In EDH, if other players see you as having advantage, they might target you. They assess you as a threat. Maybe you have 2 out of 3 pieces of an infinite combo on board. The other players might see what those pieces represent and try to stop you before you can get there. But it might be less clear than even that. Sometimes just having a faster start can make you a target. After all, having 4 to 5 mana on turn 2 represents a possible game-ending combo. All of this is happening predictably. A lot of Magic the Gathering isn't about beating what your opponent does. It's about stopping what your opponent is trying to do. To do that, you have to know what they're trying to do. You have to know what their cards and actions represent. Thanks to everyone who's been encouraging me on here. Like, comment, subscribe. Tell me why you think Lurrus shouldn't be banned, or why Ragavan should have 3 power.